And I used to go to these meetings and feel it's sort of like going back into the workplace where I was once a union rep, and it was quite tricky, all that stuff. And I started to want them to have to think about the real issues and the relationships between themselves and their roles and responsibilities. I worked a little bit with Dorothy Dalton, some of you may know, governance, edits Governance magazine, and Dorothy is an expert in charity governance. And she was a former teacher, so they loved her. It was great, it was such a wonderful fit. And they really related to her. And we started to build a strategy group with different people from the board, and I was beginning to develop a leadership team. In the last 2.5 years, we had a major decision to make. Eventually, the board realised there were three main options. We either spent out over a period of 7 years, we changed, or we stayed as we were, but actually reduced the scope of what we were going to do, and actually thought about going back in to become something of an organisation that would work with two particular trade unions. They were very clear in the end that they wanted to have change. It wasn't easy, they didn't all agree with one another, and there were difficulties in that. I won't hide that difficulty. But eventually they made a very courageous decision to actually change the organisation, root and branch, bring everything together under one roof as one organisation. And the last 2.5 years have been about that. New articles, new mission, branding, bringing it all together, transfer of assets, new governance. And again, I came back to Trustees Unlimited, who helped recruit interim trustees. And why did we do that? There were so many conflicts of interest, including the fact, although we worked very successfully for many years and still do on fundraising issues with Bates World's Braithwaite, we actually felt that we had different solicitors with Chinese walls. And I really felt we needed to change all of the kind of professional advisors really around the legals. And we actually went out, eventually we moved to Farrers and been working with Anne-Marie Piper. And the reason we did that was we needed fresh voices, because Bates Wells had always given us excellent advice, but actually there was a sense in which the board needed to be woken up. And I don't know if anyone's met Anne-Marie or worked with Anne-Marie Piper. She's quite a powerhouse person, and she's terrific. But I chose her very specifically because I knew she'd call it as it was. And she called my chair in to say, privately, which was the most uncomfortable meeting I've ever done. I think worse than having to dismiss people when I've been on the board as a chair and as a chief executive, and I've done that, or fire somebody for a misdemeanor, gross misconduct. And we actually had a private meeting where she laid on the line that actually she thought they were on the verge at various points of being in breach of trust over certain issues, and that he and the board needed to take very seriously the need to make sure that conflicts were better managed. And for me, it was wonderful to have somebody say that. That's where Ian and Emma came in, and basically we started to look for people to come in, so that when we did the transfer of assets, we had trustees who were able to look at the business plan independently and actually challenge us productively, but challenge us and their fellow board members around the plans and the ideas, and whether or not actually this was a viable proposition and in the best interest of the people we serve, the beneficiaries and so on. So we brought in, I think I'm trying to remember, Emma, was it about, I couldn't believe the number of people was huge.
Yeah, it's about half a dozen.
We brought in 6, but you brought to us, I think, something like 50 odd applications.
Oh, sorry, Julian, yes, in total, it was one of the best responded to, and most quickly, actually, which was heartening. But yeah, there was about 50 applications in total, and Ian and I halved that, and then through consultation with Julian again, actually met about 15 or 16 of those, and then we reduced it again to, I think there was about 8 or 10.
We came down to 8, I think.
Yeah.
So it was a huge response for a niche charity in education. And actually, I was amazed by the level and the standard and the quality of the people and their expertise from right across the board, from within charity sector organisations, people who've worked with voluntary organisations, commercial people, lawyers, younger people, a range of people in terms of gender and ethnicity, which was going to be great for our board, really. So we set then up a process. Now, as chairs, I'm keen to kind of tell you about the process I went through with the chair. So by this point, we had segued out one chair. did a very big thank you to him. He segued out intact and with a sort of sigh of relief. Our relationship was very good, and although we'd been through moments where it was kind of tricky, and his wife would step in occasionally to say to me privately, I don't want him to get stressed. And I'd say, his health is paramount. I don't want him to get stressed either. But that's how tricky some of it was. And particularly with working with general secretaries of trade unions who are quite used to negotiating full on and hard. There were moments when it was very stressful for both of us, but we survived it. And I think the reason we survived it was we agreed to be very honest with each other and not to make it so personal that it became a battleground. You know, when it was difficult, we agreed to acknowledge it was difficult. That worked well. The chair who took over was from a different sector in education, very different character, very much more placid in nature, and she and I then began to develop a relationship. When we recruited the new trustees, we made sure that the relationship was at the heart of it. So apart from skills, and they did interviews, we did sifting internally, company secretary and myself. We then did work with the chair and subcommittee chairs who were on the strategy group. They interviewed people, so they had the chance to make the choices and put people forward to the board. When they'd made their choices, we then decided it was really important to spend time getting to know people. So we started to develop what I call afternoon tea sessions. And we literally went out to a hotel where we actually had a small room and had afternoon tea, where we were on sofas really. The aim of all that, and it sounds kind of extravagant in a way, and I was worried people would criticise me for kind of, spending money on trivialities or jollies. But actually the purpose of it really was to develop relationships between people, because it seems to me on boards, you spend a lot of time in those rooms together, and unless people know each other a little bit before they go into a room, something about their backgrounds and their interests and the issues around the charity, and they can talk with one another, you end up in a very stilted environment. And what happened after they began to meet one another, they came into the room to tackle the business issues far more as people coming in with skills who were willing to ask questions of one another, as well as me as chief executive and the emerging leadership team that we began to put in place. So I have found that the use of interim trustees was fantastic. We went through a process, it took 4 months. Some of them have moved on, and I think 5 of the 8 are going to go forward to be on the permanent new board. We are having an advisory forum which will be elected, and not the Electoral Reform Society, Engage UK are doing our elections for a new advisory forum, a national advisory forum, which has voluntary sector organisations, institutional organisations, trade unions and individual teachers, lecturers and staff, and they will have a number of people who they can elect to the board. Other people will be appointed to the board by an appointments committee which is being independently chaired, and the board are choosing their independent chair next week. So our use of interim trustees has been really, really helpful to managing conflicts of interest. And I suppose what have I learned most about governance? Because I am a governor myself. I sit on a board, and I have been a chair in the past. I was chair of an organisation in East London Dance, which was the dance agency for East London, which has grown hugely and is very, very successful. And I've learned such a lot doing it. I've learned that actually conflicts of interest are usually poorly managed in charities, actually, is my experience. And that people shy away from really digging down into that issue. And actually, if you can dig into it a little and you manage it better, actually you get more out of the organisation, because instead of being sleepy, people start to wake up and become alert to actually what's important. It's easier for a chief executive, I've found, to have a board that is actively engaged, and even if occasionally we might have to have conversations and that where we say, actually I think that's my role as chief executive rather than your role as governors, it's better to do that. Honest conversations really pay off. Today, so many of our organisations, whether they're big or small, have to be a little bit more, what I call, for want of a better term, more commercially savvy. And it's partly because we've lost so much funding over the years. So we're all, even if we're not looking to generate commercial income, we're all trying to manage our stakeholder relationships in a more business-like way, perhaps. perhaps that's the term that's best used, without losing the essence of what voluntary sector work is about, which is grassroots, people, in our case, at the chalk face. You don't want a board that's just full of business people for a charity. You want some business people, you want some people with expertise in particular areas, and you want some people who work, you know, as who are the kind of beneficiary representatives. And finding the right balance is quite tricky. Use of interims has been tremendously successful. The board really enjoyed it, and they enjoyed the experience of new blood coming in and having a sense of vitality around it. So it's been very, very powerful. So I would say both on the interim side for the executive team, or at the moment I might be looking for, maybe coming to see, an interim head of fundraising. I've got a role that we've tried to recruit to. We've had some amazing people, but none of them have been quite right. And I think we're considering whether we'll use an interim until we've actually rethought how we'll do the internal world on the fundraising team. We've got a great fundraising team. They've had to work very differently, new CRM systems. There's been a lot of challenge in the leadership team. I've changed the leadership team over time. We're trying to embed the notion that actually, if you're not in the leadership team, it doesn't